extremely ridiculous in its own sources. But let's come to the history of the Kabba. As a side note, it is important to point out that pre-Islamic Arabia was extremely underdeveloped and primitive. Literature had no big importance, and written texts basically didn't exist. That's why it's really hard to find out anything about pre-Islamic history, and many people are forced to read the biased Islamic view. Islamic sources claim that Abraham built the Kaaba for Allah and designated it as a place for current Islamic practices, like circling it, fasting, sacrificing animals, and so on. It is declared to be the most important thing about Abraham, one of the most important things to Allah. The problem is that the Bible never mentioned the Kaaba. Now, Islam claims that Allah is the same God of the Bible. But if all of this is really the way Islam tells us, then why was the Kaaba never mentioned in the Bible? Why was it never mentioned in Jewish traditions, in the Talmud? Why was it not held important among Christians at all? The Quran even claims that Allah gave Abraham the mission to instate practices like circling the Kaaba or sacrificing. But Christians and Jews don't do such a thing. If that place was so important to Allah, who Muslims claim is the same God of the Bible, it would have been frequently visited by Christians and Jews everywhere. But there is no mention of the Kaaba at all in the history of Christianity and Judaism before Islam. Only Islamic sources claim that Christians and Jews also respected the Kaaba religiously, but there is no evidence to that. That's why many historians don't buy that story. Some Muslims attempt to prove that the Kaaba was actually mentioned in the Bible by pointing at one part of the Bible where it talks of Abraham building an altar. But according to the Bible, Abraham built several altars for God in multiple places, not only one. The same apologists who make such claims totally ignore that fact. Also, the Kaaba had hundreds of other idols that were instead revered by other pagan tribes around Mecca. The narrative is that Abraham himself was given the Kaaba and he was given the mission to spread the word about it. Yet when we look at the history of the Kaaba, we see that the Kaaba is not found in history. Christians and Jews, who were the people who ran with the Abrahamic tradition and history, had no idea what a Kaaba is until Islam came forth in the 7th century and started, becoming relevant in the world. So how do you guys exactly explain that, for example? Is that a discussion that you guys have? How does that exactly work? To me, it seems that to me it seems that the Kaaba.
Why does it bother you?
Well, because to me it seems that the Kaaba is a pre-Islamic pagan
why does it
Arab.
Bother you? You're not a Muslim, so you don't have to believe it. Why does it bother you?
Well, because it proves Islam wrong.
How does it prove Islam wrong?
Because the Kaaba is, as it seems, a pre-Islamic Arab pagan element, which Muhammad simply incorporated into the Islamic religion. It has nothing to do with Abrahamic religion.
And can you prove that?
Well, you can you? I mean, it is very reasonable to come to the conclusion that it has no connection.
Well, no, you're making the claim. Can you prove it?
I can prove that it has no connection to Abrahamic religion.
Go on, then. Prove it.
Yeah, I can prove it. Here, it takes no place within the Abrahamic biblical scripture. It has no connection. It is not within the knowledge of Jews and Christians prior to Islam. There is the proof.
Well, no, Yo, what's up, guys? I got a real special Eid gift for you, and that's Refuting Apuss. Did Abraham build the Kaaba in the history of Kabba? So you just saw the video that I just played before my response. So basically, Apuss asked two questions. Why was the Kaaba never mentioned in the Bible? Then he asked why the Kaaba is not mentioned before Islam, the Quran, etc., or the Prophet Muhammad. So I'll be answering all these points. Now, Apuss then claims that the Kaaba was always a pagan, idolatrous shrine or tradition. So he alleges that the Kaaba was always pagan, and the Prophet Muhammad stole the Kaaba from the pagans, but it was a pagan temple to begin with. It was never connected to Abraham. So let's address the last point and move on to the earlier points. So his last point is that, well, it's not true that the Kaaba was always a pagan shrine or temple. We have to read what the, well, let's go into the Orientalists and let's go into these Western scholars of Islam, since Apuss just respects Western and Orientalist and European scholarship on Islam, because he's basically plagiarizing. We all know Apuss was plagiarizing off Answering Islam, and what does Answering Islam do? They plagiarize off Western scholars and Orientalists, etc. So where are the Western scholars, or where are the Orientalists getting their information about Islam? They're getting it from our sources. They're getting it from Bukhari, Muslim, Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham, the history of Al-Tabari, Ibn Sa'd, Abu Dawud. They're getting it from the Hadith, and they're getting it from the biographies of the Prophet Muhammad. So all these Western scholars and Orientalists that Apuss has a hard-on for, that he keeps sucking their dick, they're getting their information from our sources, from our Muslim sources, right? So, so what do our sources, which the academics and Western scholars use, what do they use? They use our sources to understand the history of pre-Islamic Arabia. There's no way around this if you're, a Western scholar or Orientalist. So we read in this book, Ibn Ishaq, The Life of Muhammad, a translation of Ibn Ishaq Sirat Rasulullah by Alfred Guillaume. We read on pages 35 to 36, which I'll get to right now. It says, the story of Amr bin Lu and the account of the idols of the Arabs. It says, let me just get to that. Okay, he says, they say at the beginning of stone worship among the sons of Ishmael was when Mecca became too small for them. They wanted more room in the country. Everyone who left the town took with them a stone from the sacred area to do honor with it. Wherever they settled, they set it up and walked around as if they went around the Kabba. This led them to worship what stones they pleased and those which made an impression on them. Thus, as generations passed, they forgot their primitive faith and adopted another religion for that of Abraham and Ishmael. They worshipped idols and adopted the same errors as the people before them. Yet they retained and held fast practices going back to the time of Abraham, such as honoring the temple and going around it, the great and little pilgrimage, and the standing of Arafah and Muzdalifah, sacrificing the victims in the pilgrim city in the great and little pilgrimage, while introducing elements which had no place in the religion of Abraham. So we read in this book, The Life of Muhammad Ibn Ishaq. We read that that Abraham and Ishmael were the first ones to build the Kaaba, do the circling around it, and then after Ishmael, his sons developed paganism, or they developed idolatry after the death of Ishmael, when his sons multiplied in Arabia or Mecca. We also see this in this book. So basically, who was Al-Tabari? Al-Tabari writes about the history and the beliefs of the Kaaba before Islam. Al-Tabari was one of the most prolific writers of early Islam, most notably in the fields of science and history. Al-Tabari wrote about concentrating much about the effort and study of pre-Islamic religion and history of Arabia. So Al-Tabari was an intellectual in the early years of Islam, who wrote much about, or collected information about, pre-Islamic religion and the history of Arabia before the Prophet Muhammad was born. Let's see what he writes in his most famous book, The Book of the Idols, which documents the beliefs and history of the pre-Islamic Arabs. He writes in his most famous book, Kitab al-Nasam, or the Book of the Idols, which provides detailed description of the pre-Islamic religion of Arabia. He writes in the Book of Idols, pages 4 to 5, he writes of what the Arabs believed about the Kaaba before Islam. He writes that he personally, Hashim bin Muhammad al-Tabari said, I was informed by my father and others, and I personally checked and asserted their report that Ishmael, when the son of Ishmael, the son of Abraham, settled in Mecca, he begot many children. Their descendants multiplied so much that they crowded the city and supplements its inhabitants, the Alchemites. So basically, he retells what was being told about what Ibn Ishaq was and Ibn Hisham were saying. He said, no one left Makkah without carrying away with him a certain stone from the stones of the sacred house as a token of reverence to it and a sign of deep affection to Makkah. Whenever he settled, he would erect the stone and circumlate it in a manner. So when his departure, seeking therefore his blessing and affirming deep affection for the sacred house. And in fact, the Arabs still venerate the Kaaba and Makkah and journey to them in order to perform the pilgrimage and visitation. This led to the worship of whatever they took fancy and caused them to forget the former worship. So the sons of Ishmael were taking stones and idols away from the Kaaba, and they were worshiping it, and then they brought it back to the Kaaba. And that's the origin of idolatry or paganism. So the point is that paganism, that the Kaaba didn't start off as a pagan temple. It became a pagan temple after the death of Abraham, after the death of Ishmael, and after the Arabs were bringing stones, worshiping stones, bringing it back to the Kaaba after they left Mecca, and they became pagan because, according to Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, someone named Amr bin Lu, who was one of the sons of Ishmael, introduced paganism to the Kaaba. So the Kaaba didn't start off as a pagan temple; it became a pagan temple because of one of the sons of Ishmael. Ishmael and Hagar were in Arabia, according to Galatians chapter 4, verse 25. Even Christian commentators note this. As for the Arabs being the sons of Kedar and Ishmael, this was documented before Islam. The Prophet Muhammad did not invent the idea that Ishmael was the ancestor of the Arabs. This was documented before Islam. See the writings of Josephus, the first century historian. As for the Prophet Muhammad's descent or his genealogy, which traces back to Kedar and Ishmael, see the History of Al-Tabari, volume 6, pages 38 to 39. Kedar, who was one of the sons of Ishmael, was in Arabia. See, according to the Bible, Kedar was in Arabia. See Isaiah chapter 21, verse 16, Isaiah chapter 42, verse 11, Isaiah chapter 60, verse 7, Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 10, and Ezekiel chapter 27, verse 21. All these Old Testament verses say or state that Kedar was in Arabia before the rise of the Prophet Muhammad, or even before the Prophet Muhammad was born. Kedar, who was one of the sons of Ishmael, was in Arabia, according to the Old Testament, or according to the Bible, as you see in the verses are right there. Isaiah chapter 60, verse 7 is possibly talking about the altar and temple of the Kaaba, or the temple in Jerusalem or Zion, but the context is talking about Kedar, who was in Arabia. The Bible does not say Zion and Jerusalem are the only temples or altars, so it's possible that there's another temple or altar, and the only temple and altar in the place of Kedar was the Kaaba. So it's possible that Isaiah chapter 60, verse 7 is talking about the Kaaba, but I don't know. I don't know for sure, but there were other altars and temples besides the one in Jerusalem or Zion. So it's possible that the temple or the altar in Arabia where Kedar was is talking, or Isaiah chapter 60, verse 7 is talking about the temple, which is the Kabba. The Kabba can be considered a temple or a place of sacrifice. So, it's possible that Isaiah chapter 60, verse 7 is talking about the Kabba. I saw a video where a Jewish rabbi was admitting that Isaiah chapter 60, verse 7 is talking about the Kabba, in Makkah. But I don't know, I'm not really pushing this argument, but it's possible that Isaiah chapter 60, verse 7 is talking about the Kaaba in Makkah, but I'm not going to push that argument. So, but it is a interesting theory on Isaiah chapter 60, verse 7. As for the Kaaba existing before Christianity or Islam, this was the other point that Apuss brought up. He said, well, why is there no mention of the Kaaba before Islam or before Islam or before the Prophet Muhammad? Or there's or as you saw in the clips before, Apuss claims that there's no connection, there's no Abrahamic connection to the Kaaba, or the Kaaba didn't exist before Islam. That's basically the gist of his argument. That's false. The Kaaba did exist before Christianity and Islam. There is a Greek historian named Diatris Citrus, a first century Greek historian who was writing at least 100 years before Jesus, discussing Arabia. He writes, the people that inhabited these parts are called the Biozenes and live among wild beasts taken hunting. Here is a sacred temple in high veneration among the Arabians. You see the quote right there. So this is certainly a reference to the Kaaba in Mecca. Further, we read about a Christian Arab, who wrote a book called Arabs Before Islam. Here's what he writes about the Kaaba in Mecca. He writes that there is no mention of Mecca or the Kaaba in the books of the Greeks or of antiquity, except what is found in the book of Diatris, the first century before Christ, in his discussion about the Nabateans. In that, he refers to Mecca, and he writes, and beyond the land of the Nabateans is the region of the Bezomenians, and there is a sacred temple in high veneration amongst the Arabs. He does not just stop there. He even explains as to whom Diatris refers to, using the word Byzantines. He writes the Arabic wording. As for the Byzantines, sometimes by it are intended the Jumarites, who are a Yemeni tribe, or other Arabian tribes who are custodians of Mecca. So my point is that Apuss is dead wrong. Apuss could not be more wrong if he tried. There's a notion, or there is a belief, or there's mention of the Kaaba in Mecca before the Prophet Muhammad, or before even Jesus was born. There was a temple, or there was a mention of Mecca in the Kaaba before the rise of Islam, before the rise of the Prophet Muhammad, before the rise of Christianity. There was a Greek historian living at least 100 years after, or 100 years before Jesus, who writes about the temple in Arabia, or the temple in Mecca, or the temple in high veneration amongst the Arabs. Where were the Arabs? The Arabs were in Arabia. And what is the only temple, or what is the only sacred temple in Arabia? It's the Kaaba, or it's Mecca, or the Kaaba. So Apuss is dead wrong, because there was even a even a secular Greek historian who was not part of the Jews or whatever. Even he writes that there was the Kaaba existed, or there was a Kaaba before the rise of Christianity, or before the rise of Islam. So the Kaaba predates Islam and Jesus by hundreds and hundreds of years, according to the Greek historian Demetrius, who was writing 100 years before Jesus Christ. So Apuss is dead wrong on that too. Why now? The question really rises: why is the Kaaba, Abraham going to Mecca, Abraham building the Kaaba? Why is this not mentioned in the Old Testament or the Bible? Well, there are some theories as to why there's no mention of Abraham going to Mecca or the Kaaba, or there's no mention of Abraham going to Mecca or building the Kaaba in the Old Testament. It's possible that whoever wrote the book of Genesis simply didn't know about Abraham going to Mecca or building the Kaaba, or it's possible that the Old Testament is essentially a Jewish book, or it documents the history of Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes of Israel. So it's not going to concentrate on the history of Arabia, or Ishmael, or the Ishmaelites, or Abraham going to Mecca and building the temple of the Kaaba. It's not going to mention that, because that's not the focus of the Old Testament. The focus of the Old Testament, or the book of Genesis, etc., is documenting the history of the Jews or the history of Isaac and Jacob and the tribes of Israel, etc. So it's not. I don't think so. It's possible that whoever wrote the book of Genesis wasn't interested in that fact because they were only concentrating on the history of Isaac, Jacob, the Jews, etc. But anyways, the Torah that we have today is altered, edited, and corrupted, as we see in Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8 says, "How can you say we are wise when the lying pen of the scribes has falsified the Torah and made it into a lie?" Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8. So the Torah was corrupted by the time of Jeremiah, as even Christian commentators like Adam Clark admit that Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8 is talking about the corruption of the Torah, during Jeremiah's time. So even Christian scholars and commentators on the Bible are admitting that Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 8 is talking about the corruption of the Torah. So who knows what was taken out, added to the book of Genesis. Who knows who wrote the book of Genesis? The book of Genesis came at least 1,000 years after Moses, was written by anonymous people. We don't know who wrote the book of Genesis for sure. We know for a fact that Moses didn't write the book of Genesis, and we know that whoever wrote the Torah was writing using 4 different sources: J, E, P, and D. They were taking these sources, these anonymous sources, and writing the Torah, or the text of the Torah, the 5 books of the 5 books of Moses. So they were writing anonymously using unknown sources, etc. So who knows? Who wrote the book of Genesis? Who knows what the sources were, or whether the sources were reliable? So this is a documented fact that Moses didn't write the Torah, and the book of Genesis was written anonymously using unknown sources, or sources that we don't have access to today. So the Torah, or the book of Genesis, is altered, changed. So who knows who altered and changed the book of Genesis, or the Torah to begin with? I would just recommend this book, The Bible Unearthed, Archaeological New Vision of the Ancient Israel and the Origin of its Sacred Text, by Israel, Neil, etc. It's called The Bible Unearthed, and this is a perfect book if you want to know the history of the Old Testament and how we got the Torah today, the book of Genesis, Leviticus, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, how these books came to be, and how these books were edited, changed, and altered as time went on, and how Moses did not write anything in the Torah, and how the Torah that we have today came at least 1,000 years after Moses died. Get this book. It's called The Bible Unearthed, where these scholars talk about how we got the Torah today, and this debunks the whole idea that Moses wrote the Torah, and that the Torah came hundreds of years after Moses died. It was edited, changed, altered, and the sources used. The sources used for the compilation of the Torah were J, E, P, and D, 4 anonymous sources that were used to write the book of Genesis, etc. But the book of Genesis, my point is that the book of Genesis does not reflect accurate history to begin with, because it's been altered, changed, written anonymously. It was written after Moses. There's a lot of historical inaccuracies in there, and anachronisms. So my point is, get this book, The Bible Unearthed, to really read about how the Torah was edited, changed, how it was written, and how people were adding and corrupting things in the Torah. So I would just recommend this book, The Bible Unearthed, where it talks about the history of the Old Testament and the Torah, and how it was edited, changed, etc., as time went on. So the Torah that we have today is definitely not reliable history. So hopefully this concludes my video, and hopefully this debunks all of Apuss's argument. I think this debunks all of Apuss's. And of course, the Quran states that the Bible, or the current scriptures of the Jews and Christians, which is the biblical canon we have today, today's Old Testament and today's New Testament, is corrupted and altered. See the Quran chapter 2 verse 75, Quran chapter 2 verse 79, Quran chapter 5 verse 13 to 15, Quran chapter 4 verse 157, etc. Also see Tafsir, or the commentary of Ibn Kathir being the most important Orthodox Muslim commentator, or ancient commentator on the Quran, who incorporated earlier scholars, where he talks about how where he gives a exegesis, or he gives a commentary on the entire Quran using like the disciples and companions of the Prophet Muhammad themselves to explain certain Quranic verses, or he's one of the most important exegesis or commentators on the Quran. Tafsir Ibn Kathir on the Quran chapter 2 verse 75, Quran chapter 2 verse 79, Quran chapter 5 verse 13 to 15, 13 to 15, where it talks about the Jew, where the Quranic verses talks about the Jews and Christians corrupting or altering or in changing their Bible using those Quranic verses. So if you read Tafsir Ibn Kathir on the Quran chapter 2 verse 75, Quran chapter 2 verse 79, Quran chapter 5 verse 13 to 15, Ibn Kathir states that those verses are clearly talking about the Jews and Christians corrupting their books, which is, the Old Testament and the New Testament, since the Old Testament and New Testament were canonized before the Prophet Muhammad was even born. So when the Quran's talking about the corruption of the scriptures of the Jews and Christians, it's really talking about the corruption of the Old Testament and New Testaments that we have today, since those books were canonized before Islam was even brought up. So the Quran is talking about the corruption of the Bible. So Apuss is debunked on every single level here. Apuss does not know the history of the Kabba, and he doesn't know common sense. So hopefully this video clarifies these points, or